I think that the first speaker we have lined up is going to offer a particularly interesting and potentially provocative take on the Belton Road. He is Martin Jacques, the author of an extremely successful book called When China Rules the World, The End of the Western World, and the Birth of a New Global Order. It was published in 2009, and since then it's been translated into 15 languages, sold over 400,000 copies, and his TED Talk on how to understand China has over 2 million views. He's a senior fellow at the University of Cambridge and also a visiting professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing and Fudan University in Shanghai. So without any further ado, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Martin to the stage.
I'm going to follow this up. Well, thank you very much, Julian. Okay, 2013, Xi Jinping made a speech in Astana in Kazakhstan about the new Silk Road, land-based. And in the following year, he made a speech in Indonesia about the maritime Silk Road. Now, essentially, this was building on already what China had been doing for over a decade with the going out strategy, which was China's turn to the world after 20 years, where basically it had concentrated on its domestic development. Of course, when he introduced the idea, it evoked immediately the history of the Silk Route. And this is highly evocative. You can see that in the way it's written about now in all sorts of different ways. But this, of course, was a project of its time, a very different time, and hugely ambitious. It is difficult to think of any other country that could come up with something like Belton Road. I mean, this lies in the Chinese tradition of great projects, you know, the Grand Canal, the Great Wall, and so on. Now, initially, when it was put out, as it were, as an idea, and it was an idea, it was a concept initially. In fact, it's never really beyond a point moved beyond that. It's not a plan, and so it was sort of presented as a possibility as for the Eurasian landmass, all the countries on the Eurasian landmass. And there was, especially across the Asian side, Central Asia and East Asia, Southeast Asia, a great deal of discussion about it. And then the project began to grow because essentially, unlike Marshall Aid Plan, which was, I suppose, in a sense, a predecessor, but much smaller, today's values, the Belton Road idea is 12 times the size of the Belton Road initiative. And it was put out for a proposal, and here we are. It's grown a lot since the idea was first formulated in 2014 and 2015. And so rather than just being, as it were, one route, well, first of all, let's start with the simple one. Here is the maritime route, which takes you to the east of Africa and then up and eventually to Europe, with Greece being one of the important stocking points, the Paris port. And then there are 6 elements now to Belton Road. And this, I think, is a product of the way in which other countries have shaped it, particularly, for example, Russia's intervention or increasingly Turkey's interest in it. So you've got this route, for example, which is the China-Mongolia-Russian leg. Here you've got the Southeast Asia leg, if you like. Here you have what's called BCIM, Bangladesh, Myanmar, India, and China route. And then here you've got what's called CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Then you've got the big wave through. This is sort of more like an energy route. This route is to Europe, the Eurasian land bridge. So you've got you see how much the proposal has grown. It's got it's claimed, I don't know whether the figures are how much we can believe the figures, but there are 900 projects so far, and about $50 billion has been spent on the project. Now, and of course, I should add that the Middle East has become increasingly important in relationship to the discussion. And the two roads actually join, the maritime and the land-based routes join in the Middle East. And increasingly, over the last few years, the UAE in particular has become more closely connected to these developments, and China is its second biggest trading partner. Now, where does the idea come from? What are the Chinese thinking of when they present something like this? Well, I think the best way to think about this is that China, reflecting on its own extraordinary and unprecedented and probably never to be repeated transformation, thought, well, how did we do it? We did it essentially through extremely large-scale investment led by the state, crucially in infrastructure, which produced this extremely rapid economic growth. Now, we're not a model because we're so different from other countries, but surely some of those lessons can be applicable to the Eurasian landmass. And so the idea was that especially the Asian part of the Eurasian landmass, where many of the countries are poor, that perhaps the Eurasian landmass can be transformed in the same way that China has been transformed by this kind of approach. And I think that if we to understand China, one of the key words I think you have to understand, we have to grasp, is development. China is, in our time, the great exponent of development. By development, I mean development for the developing world. China is the master of this experience, and is obviously in a very different position to the United States or Europe and so on, because as rich countries, as developed countries, they don't have the same affinity with it, they don't have the same experience of it. China does. So if there was one country that was going to be able to take this initiative, it was China, because China has this experience, because China has the vision, China has the money, and also think of China not just as a country, but as a continent. Not just as a continent, but in my view, as a sub-global system in its own right. 1/5 of the world's population, huge landmass, and so on. So this is where we are. Now, the third point I want to make is the impact that the Belton Road is likely to have. The Belton Road Initiative, well, I don't know how successful it's going to be. It's a very long-term program. Don't measure it in 5 years or 10 years. I think, in a minimum, several decades, maybe 50 years, something like that, because we're talking about a huge project. But if it's even half successful, it is going to transform not just the Eurasian landmass, it's going to transform the world as we know it. Now, let me draw your attention at this point to this map here. The center, where is the center of the global economy? Well, this is from Danny Quah, who's now at Lee Kuan Yew School, but it was at LSE. And in 1980, Danny Quah estimated that the center of the global economy was here, in the Eastern Atlantic, where you'd expect it to be. It was essentially, the global economy was essentially a transatlantic economy. And then slowly it's been moving. like here, and at this point it is somewhere around here. So actually not too far away from where we are now. And by 2050 he estimates that it'll be on the Sino-Indian border. In other words, what we're witnessing is the shift of the center of the global economy from here to the Eurasian landmass. This is going to be the engine of global development. This is going to be the center of the global economy. It's also, it follows, in time, will be the center, as it were, of the global polity. And so this is an extraordinary shift that in some degree, I mean, I think this is taking place, quite frankly, anyway. The question is, the speed will be accelerated by the success or otherwise of the Eurasian, of BRI. And it's worthwhile at this point also remembering that, you know, that where we are with the state of the global economy. I mean, these figures are from Huanggong at Tsinghua University, but there are lots of figures that are similar. This is GDP measured by purchasing power parity. For 2030, he estimates that China will account for 1/3 of the global economy. America, you see, is 15%, EU 13%. Second biggest will be India, 90%. Of course, India and China are the two key components in population terms of the Eurasian landmass. So we're talking about not just the landmass, but we're talking about a huge global shift. Now, of course, a project of this scale, a project of this ambition is going to face enormous problems. I think there are bound to be some really serious difficulties. So I just want to run through some of the questions that we ought to have in our minds in relationship to this. Firstly, the truth is that many of these projects are probably not, at least on financial terms, are going to fail. I mean, the Chinese are putting up $46 billion for the Pakistan-China economic corridor. I would think that a large part of that, the Pakistanis will never be able to pay off. And I think in Central Asia, the projects will, by and large, maybe 30% of those will never get paid off. In other words, crucial to the whole project, the BRI project, is Chinese largesse. Probably China will be required to put up something like $15 billion a year, maybe a bit less. That requires the Chinese economy to be continuing to be as successful as it's been so far in order to sort of underpin these developments. Now, in some countries, sure, they'll be able to pay up and it won't be a great problem and so on. But in some cases, I think that definitely won't be the case. So tremendous onus on China and potentially a big burden for China. And if things go wrong, then it's going to have an impact on the Chinese economy itself. Another problem, and that is headwinds presented by countries who are not keen on the idea. The most important example, I think, in the Eurasian landmass is India. India is slightly involved, slightly committed, as the corridor earlier I showed on the map indicates, but not that involved, and is reluctant because of a long-standing differences with China. But on the whole, what is clearly true is that most of the countries on the Asian part of the Eurasian landmass have signed up and are extending these. I think over 100 countries or something like that are supporting it. Now, the exception is Western Europe. Another exception is Western Europe. Western Europe is being it varies from country to country. Greece, for example, is very keen on it. Britain has been keen, isn't as keen as it was. France hasn't made its mind up. Germany is, still has got serious qualms about it, and so on. The big exception in Europe other 16 countries of Central and Eastern Europe have signed up to it and believe their relationship with China is probably the key to their future. Of course, another country that's not signed up and has taken the same position as it did towards the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is the United States. American firms are involved, but the American government, and America by and large so far, has shown perhaps the least interest of virtually anyone in the project. Of course, this is a very unstable part of the world. Terrorism's been a big player, big factor in it, and so on. How are the Chinese going to handle that? Because they haven't, well, they've got some experience of it in Xinjiang, but they don't have a great deal of experience of this compared with them in the United States and so on. How are the Chinese going to deal with that? I think that's going to be a big problem for them. But their argument, of course, is that what would deal ultimately with terrorism is development, is the fact that you create jobs for young people and you begin to transform the attitudes of the communities and so on. Now, I think that personally there's a lot of truth in this, but I don't think that's probably the whole picture. Anyway, these are some of the problems that China is going to face and the BRI is going to face. Now, finally, brings my final point, which is about globalization. Now, we know that globalization, as conceived in the period since 1980, the sort of Anglo-Saxon model of globalization, starting with Reagan and Thatcher, has now hit extremely serious problems with rejection of that model, strongest in the United States, to some extent also in my own country, Britain, but also a great deal of negativity in the European mainland and so on. Why? First of all, well, there are two key reasons. I mean, first of all, is obviously sections of the population in the United States and so on have done badly during the era of globalization. Basically, wages stagnated decade upon decade. And that's true of my own country, it's true of some of the other European countries as well. But there's another way in which globalization, Western-style globalization, failed. And that is that while some countries, some parts of the world, like East Asia, did really well from it, not least China, if you look at the Eurasian landmass, a lot of countries did not benefit from it. Central Asia, North Africa, and so on. So Belt and Road introduces a different model, I think, of globalization, a successor model of globalization, rooted in not the developed world, but the developing world, where growth is much faster. The growth is a bit under 2.5%, 2.5 times that of the developed world at the moment. Just worthwhile bearing this in mind, in the mid-1970s, 2/3 of global GDP was produced by the rich world, which is the West plus Japan. And now, actually, the developing world is just ahead in terms of a bit about 51, 52% compared to the West, the rich world's 48, 49%. And by 2030, the projection is that the developing world, where, let's face it, 85% of the world's population lives as opposed to only 15% in the rich world, it'll be something like 2/3 responsible, 2/3 of global GDP will come from the developing world. So this is a very new way of thinking, and the next stage of globalization would transform the world, as opposed to transforming a limiting part of the world. Another aspect of BRI is that hitherto this model of globalization, to some extent earlier globalization, was essentially a maritime phenomenon. It was the sea routes that were the transformative element in terms of trade and so on. With this, the BRI, then this is going to be a new model where the land routes will be, in many ways, probably as important as the sea routes. So that'll be another difference. Now, another aspect I think, of the impact of this model of globalization or this transformation is going to be what I'll call political, in the sense that one of the great failures of this era of globalization that we've witnessed so far is, I think, that there's a governance deficit in large parts of the world, not least in the Eurasian landmass. Not in the western part of the world, not in the China. China can never be accused of having a governance deficit. But for many countries, they are, they are undergoverned, and institutions are weak and so on. I think this era of BRI could see a major transformation in this governance deficit towards something rather different. I think also we'll see, linked to that, a rapid multiplying of institutions of lots of different kinds. I mean, if you're going to have this kind of transformation, which is based on bilateral and multilateral cooperation between countries, China obviously being central to most of them, if not all of them, then there's going to be lots of new institutions. And, ASEAN plus one is with the Chinese cooperation, or ASEAN plus three, is one of the elements, one of the models, I think, for what we're likely to see in the future in the Eurasian landmass. The other point, and the final point I want to make, is this. I think it's inconceivable that if this project is, even moderately successful, let alone hugely successful, then the whole notion of polity, of what polities mean on the Eurasian landmass, is going to be transformed. It's just inconceivable that you could get these levels of cooperation, if it happens. If you get these levels of cooperation, this kind of economic transformation, on a landmass which accounts for 2/3 of the world's population, that the way in which government is conceived now, compared with what it will be in the future, will be profoundly different. And I think the change, if it's successful, will be far greater than any of the changes we saw during the Western era of globalization, which started in 1980 up until the present day. Thank you very much.
You can stay up there.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Fascinating and a lot to talk about. I want to start by asking you're clearly optimistic at some level about the potential for the BRI. You also pointed to some really daunting potential challenges, and I'm wondering how do you think we should evaluate whether this initiative succeeds or fails, or in real time is succeeding or is not succeeding?
Well, I think the crucial question is economic. I think that the bottom line here is development. I think the Chinese are right about this. After all, if you were discussing China, the key question in China's transformation since 1980 has been economic. All the other possibilities that we talk about are a result of that. So if this project succeeds in transforming the economic circumstances of many countries across the Eurasian landmass, it has to be a success. And it will transform the politics, the culture, and everything else in the process.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in asking you about that cultural dimension you just alluded to. There's a part of the BRI that has been somewhat less reported upon, which is, as you know, focused on educational exchange, cultural exchange. I'm curious to ask you, how do you see that fitting into the vision you've presented?
Well, certainly, as you probably are aware, I mean, China has opened its universities and its coffers to many students to come and be educated in Chinese universities and so on. I think that from all over the place, actually. I mean, you go to a Chinese university, it varies from university to university, but there's a hell of a lot of foreigners there. And the foreigners are not by and large Westerners. They are from all sorts of countries. The one exception tends to be India. Not so many from India, but also many different countries around the world. And I think that the cultural interaction between China and these other countries, these other cultures, is going to be absolutely fundamental to this process. Now, I don't think that, in one sense, I think the Chinese don't have much experience of this because, they've been enclosed in China until, let's say, the turn of the century. And it's only recently they've turned out with this kind of extraordinary effervescence. But in another sense, I think that China, I've written about this in my book, I mean, China is also very diverse. Okay, over 90% think of themselves as Han, but historically you can see very vividly that China is, in many respects, a multiracial country. And Chinese history also is an illustration of this. Their relationship with the Northern Steppes, their relationship with other countries in the region, and so on. So I think that this is going to be a very intense process.
Thank you. Another question that I was thinking about as you were speaking was you talked about the problem in developing countries of a governance deficit. You even talked about the BRI as a potential source of a certain transfer or transfusion of a governance idea or governance models. I'm curious to hear you say more about that, and in particular, whether you mean by that those countries in their forms of governance will begin to look more like China, or if you mean something else.
Good question. I think that I don't think that, if you look at, take Ethiopia, okay, I know that's not, or Africa they do regard as part of Belton, right? Sure. But Ethiopia is probably the country closest to China in Africa, and the most important recipient of Chinese aid. And there's no doubt that there's been a certain amount of imitation of China, politically and so on. But that's an unusual case. That's very exceptional because I can't think of another country that easily fits into that. I don't expect other countries to start modelling themselves particularly on China, although there will be that effect. I mean, that happened before, didn't it? Japan, Vietnam, Korea. I mean, they modelled themselves on China historically in bygone days, and still do. You can still see it. It's still apparent. But I think it'll be. I think they will. I think they will learn the importance of development. I think they will learn the importance. The state will become a more important institution, as it is a very important institution in China. It doesn't mean the state is very big in China. It's not actually that big, but it's extremely effective. And I think I think there could be a borrowing of that kind. I don't expect them to. I mean, clearly clearly, if you get this kind of transformation, there's going to be a completely new fluidity across the continent. Because you're saying, well, will it be part of China? Part of China? No, I don't think it'll be part of China. But in a way, China is quite a lattice-like country itself, and so I can see that sort of extension taking place. And historically, there is, let's face it, there is a sort of example of it, which was the tributary system. Now, I don't expect that to happen, and I think that, by the way, the tributary system has been, by and large, incorrectly written about about what it was. But it's certainly China has all the relationships across the continent will be, there'll be just like there was a turning to America in the heyday of the United States. Of course there was, because America was the center. America was so important and so on. There's going to be, across the landmass, a turning towards China. And it's going to get much stronger than we've seen so far, because China is going to get much more important than it is now.
Great. Thank you. So I think that with that, we have to wrap up this session. There's so much more I wish I could ask you. But thank you so much, and please let's give Martin another round of applause.